About a week ago, I released this video covering the damage of the suspicious Reforge against Withered with the new strength rework. Now, if you haven't seen that video already, I highly suggest you check it out before you watch this one, as I'll be referencing a lot of the results from that video, assuming that you've already seen it. That being said, in today's video, we'll be covering everything that you need to know about the Fabled Reforge, so you can make the final decision on whether you should stick with Withered or switch to Fabled. So, without further ado, let's get straight into the video. Alrighty, so as you can see, today's video is going to be focused more on the Fabled Reforge. Now, because the strength rework has been out for quite some time now, I figured it would make sense that I go ahead and compare the Fabled Reforge against the Withered Reforge, as the previous video was more of a test run with the Suspicious Reforge, as I figured that the Suspicious Reforge would do a lot of damage, as the ability does boost your normal weapon damage, which is actually what One For All does, and One For All is currently the meta when it comes to enchants. Now, also since the last video, I managed to get my hands on a One For All giant sword. Now, this is something that I definitely want to test with in the previous video, as in the previous video, I was using an emerald blade, which is the one that I have here in my ender chest. And the problem with the emerald blade is that because when we do the dungeon test, the dungeons technically doesn't actually have a purse, the emerald blade doesn't really do that much good damage. And it's also not even a dungeonizable weapon, so it kind of defeats the purpose of testing in dungeons. And having a giant sword to test inside of dungeons and outside of dungeons with is going to be very useful against the Scylla, which we'll be comparing everything up against as well. Now, just to give you guys a quick recap on what's going to happen in today's video, if you haven't already seen the Suspicious one, please go and check that one out right now. I will be referencing to the Suspicious Reforge a lot and talking about a couple of the numbers in today's video. We'll go through the Crypticals first, followed by the 9,000 health Enderman in the end, and then we'll do the dungeon tests against the Crypt Undead in floor 7. And then once we have covered all of the Withered damage Reforge numbers, we'll go ahead and test the Fabled Reforge with both of the weapons, and then we'll do a comparison side by side, and I'll share my thoughts later on in the video. So here we are down in the crypts now, but before we do get into all of the damage testing for today's video, just so you don't have to flick back to the previous one to see all my stats or if anything's changed since then, I'll give you guys a quick rundown of all of the gear that we'll be using in today's video, my armor, weapons, talismans, and all of that good stuff. So just like the last video, I have not changed my armor set. I still have my 3/4 Necron armor, my Tarantula helmet, all recombobulated and all good to go. I will be using this 5-star Scylla with the enchant, so you can see up on the screen right there. It does have the Art of War, Fuming Hot Potato Books, a recombobulator, it's 5-starred and all of that good stuff. And just like I mentioned before, I will be using a One For All giant sword in today's video. It does have a 6th star on it, although that will not make any differences at all, as I'm not testing in master mode, so the 5 stars will be fair against both weapons. As for talismans, I've got 11 mythic, 8 legendary, 2 epic, 21 rare, 11 uncommon, and 14 common talismans, where all of them are either on shaded or forceful for some of the commons. And then for the mythics and also the legendaries, I do have strong as the Reforge. And like I mentioned in the previous video, I could try and optimize my talismans a little bit better to try and get some more damage and optimize for damage rather than strength. Although I did have a look at that and I tried to do some optimizing, but I couldn't really figure out anything that works well. And I just figured I'd stick with my current talisman setup, because either way, the damage test should be fair amongst each Reforge. But moving on from the talismans, I am still Combat 50, Foraging 31, and also Catacombs 32. And for this video, I will not be using any pets whatsoever. Just like I mentioned in the last one, I do not want any pet items or special abilities really affecting anything. And that way, if we use no pets at all, we get the raw and best damage numbers for you guys to see. So now that we have all of my stats out of the way, let's go ahead and actually get these damage tests off on the Crypticals. So I will be starting things off with the Scylla, and then we'll follow it up with the Giant Sword on the Crypticals. So right over here, if we get a hit on the first Cryptical, we do 211,000 damage, followed by 260,000, but that was the Ring of Love ability. We do another 211,000 damage over there, 211,000 damage there, and the same damage numbers apply to basically all of the mobs right there. And now if we switch over to the Giant Sword to get some damage numbers off with this weapon instead, going ahead and getting some hits on the Criticals, we do 555,000 damage, and then 556,000 damage, followed by 556,000 damage, 556,000 damage again, and just for good measure, we do another 556,000 damage with the Giant Sword. And now making our way over to the end now, we're going to do the exact same thing, but just on the Enderman for the Ender Slayer ability on the Scylla. So if I go ahead and get some hits on these right here, we did 263,000 damage on both of those hits, followed by 264,000 damage on those two there. And just for good measure, another 264,000 damage with the Withered Scylla. And now moving on to the Giant Sword now, if we get some hits on the Enderman, 555,000 damage first up, followed up by 556,000, 557,000, and then 557,000 again. And then just for good measure here, we do another 557,000 damage with the Giant Sword. And that's no surprise because the Giant Sword doesn't really do anything special as it's only got one for all. And now moving on to the dungeon runs here to get some dungeon damage numbers for you guys to see. Since the last video, I have decided to pick the Berserker class and not my Archer class, so if it helps you, I am using Berserker level 22, and then all of the other gear is exactly the same. But as we normally do here, we'll start off with the Scylla on this Crypt Undead right here. So if I go ahead, blow up this Crypt and see how much damage we deal, we do about 1.4 million damage with the Scylla. And then if I go ahead and blow up this Crypt over here and get another set of damage numbers for you guys to see, we'll do another 1.4 million damage once again on the second Crypt Undead. And now moving on to the Giant Sword here, if I go ahead, blow up this Crypt and see how much damage we deal, we do around 3.3 million damage on the Crypt Undead from that Crypt. And then moving over here to the other side of the room, if we go ahead, blow up this Crypt and deal some damage as well, we do another 3.3 million damage with the Giant Sword, so it's definitely a pretty significant increase. So as you guys can see from those damage tests, the one for all Giant Sword definitely does a significantly higher amount of damage than the Scylla. However, that isn't the point of this video. Those damage tests were just to give you guys the control numbers to see how much damage Withered does with two different styles of weapon. And now that we have the Withered damage out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and put these Fabled Reforge stones onto the two weapons that we were just using, and we'll go ahead and repeat all of those tests once again to get the Fabled damage numbers, and we'll see how much damage Fabled does instead. So back at the graveyard now, I've gone ahead and I have reforged both of these weapons to have Fabled on them now. Now the one thing that I do want to point out before I do any of these damage tests is that Fabled is really inconsistent. Now, I'm only going to be doing 5 hits per mob when I do test the Fabled Reforge. However, 5 hits probably isn't enough to get a very accurate damage spectrum. If it were to be a lot more accurate, I would have to have a much larger sample size of damage to give you guys, so that way you can compare it better to the Withered Reforge that is a consistent Reforge. But since I'm not going to be able to test that many Crypt Undeads when we get over to the dungeon runs, I've gone ahead and just stuck with the usual 5 hits per mob, and then I'll try and get 2 Crypt Undeads per dungeon. But I figured I would preface that before I get any hefty damage numbers out of the way, so you guys are aware of that for these damage tests. And with that being said, if I go ahead and start using my Scylla to get some hits on these Crypt Ghouls, the first hit did about 213,000 damage, followed up by 218,000 damage on the second hit, doing about 204,000 damage on the third hit, 238,000 damage on that fourth hit there, and then around 218,000 damage on the final hit. So moving on to the Giant Sword now, if I go ahead and get some hits on the Crypt Ghouls, we do about 555,000 damage for the first hit, followed by 546,000, then 557,000, 542,000 again, and then 574,000 damage on the final hit. And now back in the end to test the Fabled damage as opposed to the Withered Reforge, if we go ahead and get some hits on these 9,000 health Endermen, we do 274,000 damage, followed by 292,000 damage, doing another 254,000 damage, 292,000 damage once again, and then 299,000 damage on the final hit. And now if I go ahead and move over to the Giant Sword damage numbers, we do about 587,000 damage on that first hit, then we did about 594,000 on the second hit, 604,000 on the third, 527,000 damage on the fourth, and then 564,000 damage on the final hit. And now moving on back over to the dungeon runs here, I do have a Crypt right behind me, and we're going to test the damage of the Scylla first up. So if I go ahead, throw the Super Boom TNT down and get a hit on the Crypt Undead, we did 1.5 million damage on that Crypt Undead. And if I go ahead and blow up this second Crypt over here to get the damage of the Scylla, getting a hit on the Crypt Undead, we did another 1.5 million damage with the Scylla once again. And now for the damage of the Giant Sword, I'll go ahead and blow up both of these Crypts at the same time here, getting about 3.2 million damage on the first hit, and then 3.3 million damage on the second hit using Fabled and the Giant Sword. So now that we have finished all of the damage tests with both the Withered and the Fabled Reforge, now it's time to talk about a lot of the interesting things that I did notice when doing all of these damage tests. Now, as a general rule of thumb, the Scylla definitely didn't do as much damage as the one for all Giant Sword, but the Giant Sword, like I said before, isn't really the main focus of this video. I just used two different weapons to get some different damage numbers with the whole strength rework. And from what I could see, both of these Reforges are very comparable. The Fabled difference is most noticeable with the Giant Sword, where a lot of the time the Giant Sword could deal anywhere near around 540,000 damage outside of dungeons, up until 600,000 damage outside of dungeons as well. Although when we were using the Withered Reforge, it was only doing around 556,000 damage, which means that the Giant Sword is kind of missing out on around 40,000 bonus damage, which can be dealt, and I feel like with a lot of testing, the Fabled Reforge does come out to be stronger for the Giant Sword. However, when it comes over to the Scylla was a lot less noticeable, and the difference between the Fabled and Withered Reforges were not as drastic. The Scylla here did end up doing around 211,000 damage outside of dungeons when we were using the Withered Reforge, but when I switched over to the Fabled Reforge, I was noticing that it was doing anywhere near 200,000 damage to 230,000 damage. And like I said before, with enough testing and a proper average sort of calculated between these Reforges, the Fabled Reforge probably will do more damage than the Withered Reforge could be dealing. But the damage is incredibly comparable, and Fabled just isn't anywhere near as consistent as the Withered Reforge, and the Withered Reforge is like a very good average amount. The same rules applied for both of the weapons here when we were inside of dungeons. They both did around the same amount of damage with around 100,000 damage discrepancy, and the difference between that is very minimal inside of dungeons, and you probably shouldn't be worrying about it too much unless it's in the high millions. So when it comes to the dungeon tests, I'm not really going to talk about that too much, as these were going to be very comparable Reforges anyways. Now here's where things get interesting, and there's something that's really crucial that you guys need to know before you go out and decide, oh, it looks like Fabled must be the best Reforge and Withered is totally useless. Now, if I show you guys right here what the stats of the Wither Blood actually do, if I zoom in on the bonus of this Reforge, you can see that it grants +1 strength per Catacombs level. Now, if you recall correctly, at the beginning of the video, I showcased my Catacombs level, and I am currently a Catacombs 32 player. However, if you do play dungeons a lot more than I do, and you're probably much higher Catacombs level than me, maybe you're in the high 30s, probably in the early 40s, or maybe even close to Catacombs 50, then the Withered Reforge might actually be a lot stronger than the Fabled Reforge. Despite strength being a lot less powerful as it used to be before this update, the amount of bonus strength that you actually get from being a high Catacombs level may be strong enough to completely overpower Fabled, or at least make them so comparable that you really just choose over consistency versus that inconsistent Fabled damage. But because I'm not Catacombs 50 and because I'm not a maxed out player, I can't really confirm that for sure, and that's mainly just speculation on my end. Now, another really important thing to note that I did mention earlier on in the video is that the Fabled damage tests here are not the most accurate they can possibly be. I did do a little bit more Fabled testing off camera, just getting a couple more hits on the Crypticals and the Endermen to see sort of a rough estimate of where this Reforge lies, and I did see the Reforge dip down significantly lower than the Withered Reforge did in some instances, but it also went much higher in a lot of other instances, which makes me believe that both of these Reforges are just really comparable, and to get a thorough understanding of which one is truly better, you'd probably have to get thousands and thousands of damage tests off, because then you get a very good average amount, and then you'll be able to see how much damage that you can deal with some very specific stats. Now, another thing that I also want to bring up, as this video is focused mainly on the Withered and the Fabled Reforges, but I also want to talk about the Dirty Reforge here as well. Now, the Dirty Reforge is one that a lot of people have actually told me about in my comment section, or they go, why don't you compare things to Dirty? What about Dirty? Is Dirty ever worth it? Now, for those of you that didn't already know, I have made a video on the Dirty Reforge, and it is still relevant to this day, so if that interests you, feel free to go check that out. It'll be close to the top of the description. But if you look here at the stats of the Dirty Reforge, it gives you bonus bonus attack speed, which is really helpful in today's day and age with the whole strength changes, and it also gives you extra ferocity and then just a little bit of strength there. Now, Dirty is really helpful if you want to have higher DPS and you care more about doing lots and lots of damage over an extended period of time, but you don't really care too much about single target damage. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into the statistics of the Dirty Reforge, but as a general rule of thumb, it's not super worth it. You are much better off using either a Valkyrie or a Tiger Pet and other ferocity boosting items, as you will get enough ferocity from all of those other things instead of the Dirty Reforge. But if you want to go overkill and you just want to get that extra bit more DPS, then the Dirty Reforge is definitely a decent option. It's just not one that I'd really recommend. But with all that being said, that's going to wrap up everything that I had for today's video. So hopefully you guys did find this useful or informative in some way, especially with all these crazy changes that have happened over the past few weeks. Now, if you did have any further questions or comments about any of the damage testing in today's video, then I do stream live over on Twitch every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So if you do have any further questions about anything that I had to say in today's video, then feel free to stop by over there when I'm live. But with all that being said, that's going to wrap up everything for today's video. And as always, take care and peace. Jujubos Puggers. I need to buy one. Oh my god, why did my game crash again? Why did my game crash again, dude? This is so annoying. Play Clash of Clans or bad? I got you, bro. I got you. Alright, we're gonna play Clash of Clans, guys. Don't you worry. Don't you worry. No way, I got so many rewards, guys. No way. Peak content. Yo, trust, dude.